Have you ever felt that strange discomfort when you turn off the TV, put your phone away and realize there's no one else around? Everything has gone quiet, and yet something inside you keeps screaming. It's not physical pain. It's not an urgent problem. It's a subtle restlessness, almost invisible but devastating, the kind of feeling that has no name but weighs on your chest. Silence, in theory, should be peace. But for many people, it's terror. When the noise of the world stops, the inner noise begins. The mind races, whispers criticism, brings back uncomfortable memories, projects fears. The absence of external stimuli reveals the internal storm we've been unconsciously suppressing. And that's when the discomfort surfaces. Loneliness is not outside. It's inside, in the places where the world doesn't reach, but where we refuse to look. It's curious how we can spend the whole day surrounded by sounds, people, tasks, screens, and notifications, and yet a single moment of silence is enough to make everything fall apart, as if we were constantly running from something. And silence is the only space where we can't run, because silence doesn't distract, doesn't applaud, doesn't respond. It simply exposes, and what it reveals is often terrifying. After all, who are we when we're not busy trying to look okay? Who are we without the performance, the filters, the audience? The truth is that the discomfort of being alone reveals a wound that didn't start today. It points to years of disconnection from ourselves, to the difficulty of dealing with our own body, our own thoughts, our own existence. It's no coincidence that so many people develop compulsive habits to fill their time. We no longer know what to do when there's space left. And in the absence of distractions, we begin to discover how deeply we were conditioned to fear the void, as if the simple fact of not being with someone, of not doing something productive, meant failure. This isn't natural, it's learned. We've learned that silence is a threat, that being alone means rejection, that being still is wasting time. And behind all of this is a much crueler logic, the idea that if we're not in motion, we're not worthy of love. Silence then becomes a sentence. The pause becomes punishment, and being alone turns into a mirror we don't want to face. But why such a visceral reaction to something as simple as being alone? Maybe because we were never taught how to be our own company. We grew up hearing that good people are those who please others, who add value, who are always available. We rarely heard that being with ourselves is also valuable, that the time spent in our own presence can be a treasure, not a punishment. On the contrary, we were trained to measure our worth by the impact we have on others. If no one is watching, nothing I do matters. If I'm alone, I'm not really living. This kind of thinking, repeated over years, creates an invisible dependency. We need someone else's presence to validate our own. And that's when discomfort turns into suffering. Because the world is made of absences. People won't always be there. Life is not a constant stage. And if I only feel real when someone sees me, then I'm doomed to disappear every time I'm alone. That's not healthy. That's not inevitable. That's a symptom. A sign that maybe we've lost ourselves. A call to relearn the basics. To be, just to be, to breathe, to feel, to exist. Without having to fill, justify, or perform anything. The silence that screams at you today might heal you tomorrow. But for that, you need to listen and allow yourself to be present, even when all you hear is you. There is a kind of loneliness that doesn't depend on being physically alone. It can arise even in crowded parties, family gatherings, or long-term marriages. It's what many psychologists call relational emptiness, the distressing sensation of not being seen, even when surrounded by people. It's not the absence of others that hurts, but the absence of connection, and that pain has a deep root. Human beings are not born knowing they exist. We only discover who we are when someone looks at us with presence, when someone truly listens, when our emotions find shelter outside ourselves. That mirroring is what gives shape to our identity. And when it's missing, even as adults, we still feel like ghosts floating through the crowd. From the very first days of life, our existence depends on bonding. A baby only recognizes its worth because there is a gaze that validates it, arms that respond to its cries, a face that smiles when it smiles. This is not spoiling, it's the foundation of the psyche. And if that validation fails through absence, neglect, rejection, or coldness, A constant feeling grows within the person that they must do something to deserve attention. That love is not given, it must be earned. And so even in adulthood, that inner child continues to seek a gaze that confirms, you matter. That's why, when we're alone, the fear of disappearing returns. Because we lack the reflection that sustains the certainty that we're here, that our presence has meaning. This emptiness is not just a metaphor, it manifests physically, in the tightness in the chest, in insomnia, in the urgent need to send a message, open a social network, turn on the TV, hear a voice. We're not searching for content, we're searching for presence. The algorithm replaced affection. Notifications became proof of existence. Each like, a tiny dose of, I was noticed. But the relief is fleeting, because likes don't hug, comments don't listen. What the soul needs is real, intimate, affectionate contact, even if it's only with oneself. And here begins a cruel paradox. We run from being alone because we fear facing this emptiness, but by running, we prevent it from healing. Because only an honest encounter with our own silence can we begin to fill what once only hurt. Many people spend their lives adapting to be accepted, shaping their personality to fit into groups, erasing their desires so they don't seem difficult. And in the end, it's exactly that which sustains relational emptiness, being surrounded by people who don't know your truth, who only interact with the version you fabricate to please. This internal disconnection becomes external disconnection. And then loneliness settles in like a kind of emotional anemia. You're alive but without strength, without color, without spark. The body is present, but the soul feels invisible. Contact doesn't nourish. Relationships don't support, because everything is shallow, automatic, performative. That's why we often prefer any company rather than our own, because we've learned that the presence of another is the certificate of our importance. That if someone chooses me, I am valid. If I'm alone, I'm disposable. This logic is cruel. It makes us prisoners of empty, abusive, or indifferent relationships, because anything seems better than the silence of absence. But that's a lie that needs to be undone. Being alone doesn't mean being less. And true presence cannot be bought with effort. It is cultivated through connection, starting with the connection to who you are. Maybe the emptiness you feel isn't due to lack of people, but due to lack of truth, of sincere presence, of listening without judgment, of affection that doesn't demand performance. And all of that begins, ironically, in the place we avoid the most, inside. When you begin to listen to yourself, to validate yourself, to offer yourself the attention you always sought, that emptiness becomes less hostile. It becomes space, space to rest, to feel, to rebuild. You don't need the constant presence of others to exist. You are whole. And in the recognition of your own presence, loneliness begins to transform into solitude. Being alone wouldn't hurt so much if silence didn't create space for one of the deepest fears we carry, hearing what's going on inside our own mind. When everything outside quiets down, what's left are the thoughts, raw, disorganized, relentless. And for those who have been running from themselves for a long time, that reunion can feel suffocating. The problem isn't being alone. The problem is what we hear when there's no one around to distract us. Suddenly old judgments appear, inner voices that criticize, doubts that corrode, memories we wished we had buried, fears we pretended not to feel, frustrations we silenced out of shame. The mind becomes a battlefield, and we were never prepared to stand in the middle of this war. That's why so many people feel an almost physical anxiety when they try to spend time alone, because silence becomes an amplifier. Everything that had been muffled by the rush, the obligations, the noise of the world, gains volume. And when we don't know how to deal with that, we create desperate mechanisms to shut down the mind. Binge watching, endless scrolling, eating, drinking, sex, shopping, overworking. Anything to push away the feeling of being at the mercy of our own awareness. It's not about taste, it's a defense, an attempt to survive the internal bombardment that shows up every time life slows down. And the cruelest part is that the mind doesn't always speak with the voice of truth. It speaks with the voice of unresolved experience. Many people grew up hearing criticism, being compared, never feeling enough. That voice, internalized, doesn't go away when we grow up. It just changes form. And when we're alone, it comes back in full force. You didn't do enough. You're falling behind. You're weak. You don't deserve love. These are phrases no one needs to say out loud, because the mind has already learned to repeat them perfectly. This is the silent terror of solitude, discovering that the harshest aggressor might be living inside you. But there's something even deeper behind this, the fear of coming into contact with emotions that have been frozen. Silence forces us to feel, and for many, feeling is a dangerous place because it means facing grief, rage, abandonment, shame, old trauma. It's easier to keep going on autopilot, filling up the schedule, piling on tasks, accelerating. Noise protects us from pain, but it also robs us of healing, because no wound closes when it's ignored. No emotion dissolves when it's pushed into the corner. And while we run from our thoughts, life passes us by. We become increasingly tired, disconnected, numb. Breaking this cycle isn't easy. Relearning how to listen to the mind takes courage. It takes patience. It takes compassion. Because it's not about silencing the thoughts. It's about changing the way we hear them. Instead of believing everything they say, we can learn to observe, to question, to choose. Little by little, we can become the adult who listens with empathy to that wounded child still screaming inside. We can turn mental chaos into conversation, attack into welcome, rigidity into curiosity. Being alone then stops feeling like a punishment and begins to feel like a meeting, a space where the mind doesn't have to be the enemy, where it can finally rest. In the end, silence isn't the problem. The problem is how much we've been taught to fear it, how much we've come to associate being alone with being unwell. But what if it's the opposite? What if true relief lies in reconnecting with exactly what we've been avoiding? The mind that won't quiet down today might just be desperately trying to be heard, not to hurt us, but so that, at last, we can begin to heal. There is a deep and painful misconception in the way we use the word loneliness. Many believe it's a synonym for being alone, but it's not. Loneliness is an emotional state, not a geographical one. You can be in the middle of a crowd and feel absolutely alone. You can share a bed with someone and feel invisible, just as you can spend an entire weekend in your own company and feel peace, presence, and warmth. The problem begins when we confuse lack of company with lack of worth. When we believe that without someone by our side, our experience loses meaning. This confusion feeds silent suffering and keeps many people stuck in shallow, abusive, or simply incompatible relationships, just to avoid what they call loneliness. True loneliness is not the absence of people, but of connection. It happens when we are not seen in depth, when our emotions are ignored, our gestures are not welcomed, our silences are not respected. When we spend our lives trying to fit into bonds where no one truly asks how we are, or if they ask, they don't really listen. That kind of loneliness is exhausting. It drains our vitality because it forces us to constantly perform, to mask feelings, to act as if we're fine. And little by little we begin to fade inside. The soul withers while the body keeps moving. The smile stays on the face, but the eyes have already stopped asking to be understood. That's why being alone shouldn't be a diagnosis. It should be an opportunity, a moment of healing, of reconnection, of self-discovery. Solitude, unlike loneliness, is the art of being with oneself with joy. It's when silence doesn't oppress but embraces, when free time isn't a space to be filled, but a temple to be lived in. It's not about abandoning others, but about cultivating a relationship where your own presence is enough, where you feel whole even when no one else is around. That doesn't mean you don't need anyone. It simply means you don't lose yourself when you're alone, that you don't cease to exist without a reflection. But to reach that place, you must cross through. Cross through the initial discomfort, the anxiety that arises, the internal judgments, the fears. You must sit with the emptiness and say to yourself, "I'm here," and repeat it until that presence makes sense, until your own company becomes a place you can inhabit. It doesn't happen overnight. It's a practice, a commitment, a process of unlearning the beliefs that say life is only worth living if someone is watching. It's liberating to realize you can dance alone in your living room and still celebrate life, that you can cook for yourself and still offer care, that you can go to sleep with a light heart even without a goodnight message. Loneliness hurts when we disconnect from ourselves, when we look to others for what we don't give to ourselves, when we turn someone else's presence into proof that we exist. Solitude, on the other hand, heals. It teaches that the value of our life isn't in how many arms surround us, but in how many times we can be a place of comfort for our own pain. It's when we stop waiting for rescue and start listening to ourselves. Being alone then ceases to be a flaw and becomes power, because it is in silence that we begin to hear what should never have been ignored, the soul itself. There is a kind of loneliness that begins long before adulthood. It starts in childhood, not when the child is actually alone, but when they are surrounded by people and yet no one truly sees them. Growing up without emotional mirrors, without validation, without genuine listening, is like trying to build a house without a foundation. The result may look strong on the outside, but any inner gust of wind makes everything collapse. A child who had no room to exist in their uniqueness, who was constantly corrected, ignored, or burdened, grows up without learning the basics, how to be with themselves. And this emptiness, often invisible to others, later manifests as an unbearable discomfort with silence, free time, or their own presence. From very early on, human beings need a gaze that welcomes, a look that says, "You matter even when you're sad. I see you even when you're not smiling. Your pain makes sense even if I don't understand it." When this kind of emotional validation doesn't happen, the child doesn't just suffer, they learn to hide. They learn that certain emotions are unacceptable, that showing vulnerability drives affection away, that expressing anger or frustration is wrong, and so they begin to shape themselves to fit, to smile, to please, to be too mature and too strong when too independent, not because they want to, but because they had to, because it was the only way to be loved, or at the very least, not be rejected. And when that child becomes an adult, they carry within them an absence no relationship can fill, because the pain isn't about missing someone else. It's about never having learned to be with themselves. There's no inner intimacy, no comfort within. Everything feels too loud, too empty, too strange. And so begins the desperate search for distraction, for another's presence as anesthesia, for external approval as dopamine, for non-stop busyness as a form of escape. The fear isn't of solitude itself, but of being thrown back into the emotional darkness of a childhood room where no one ever entered with you. It's important to understand, this wound is not your fault. It's structural. People who grew up without listening, without validation, without emotional warmth, are not to blame for feeling unwell when they're alone. That's not weakness. It's the result of emotional development marked by a lack of safety. And the good news is, this story doesn't have to end that way. Even if you didn't learn to keep yourself company as a child, you can begin now. As an adult, you can build that inner mirror. You can offer yourself the care that was missing. You can sit with your inner child and with a steady and loving voice say, "I'm here now. You're no longer alone." This process is neither magical nor linear. Often it starts with discomfort, resistance, fatigue, because unlearning years of emotional abandonment takes time. But little by little something begins to change. The fear of silence fades. Free time becomes fertile ground. The mirror starts to reflect an image that no longer frightens you. And then you realize that being with yourself is not punishment. It's an opportunity, a chance to rebuild yourself from the affection you lacked, to free yourself from the beliefs that said life was only worth living if someone was watching, to discover that your presence alone is valuable, that your self-care is enough to begin, and that even if the outside world remains absent, inside, finally, lives someone who sees you. We live in a society that has turned doing into proof of worth, where every pause is suspicious, every silence is interpreted as weakness, and every moment of rest must be justified with guilt or spreadsheets. From an early age, we learn that our existence only has meaning if it produces, if it yields, if it delivers some kind of visible result. And this performance logic seeps into everything, into work, relationships, leisure, even spirituality. It's as if we're constantly trying to convince the world and ourselves that we deserve to exist. And in this context, being alone and quiet becomes almost an act of rebellion. Because if no one is watching, if nothing is being done, then what's the point of continuing? This conditioning runs so deep that even when we manage to find a moment of peace, the mind starts to sabotage. You're wasting time. Everyone else is being productive except you. This won't get you anywhere. It doesn't matter how much you've already done. It never feels like enough. And being alone in silence without a task in progress becomes a trigger for this internal system of pressure. We no longer know how to simply be. We have to be doing, improving, optimizing. Even self-care moments have become metrics. How many pages of a personal development book did you read? How many hours of meditation did you complete? How many daily goals have you checked off? And this excess of productivity comes at a high cost. It separates us from ourselves. Because deep down, those who are always busy have no time to feel. And that seems like an advantage when the feelings hurt. Better to distract than to face the anguish, right? Better to overload the schedule than deal with the internal emptiness. But the problem is that this escape becomes a prison. The body gets tired, the mind collapses, the emotions pile up. And when we finally find ourselves alone, with nothing to do, all of it spills out. The silence reveals the exhaustion we've been ignoring. The pause exposes the pain we've been pushing away. And then we understand why doing nothing feels unbearable. Because it forces us to feel. It's no coincidence that so many people suffer emotional distress when stepping away from their routines. Vacations, leaves of absence, long weekends, moments that should bring relief, often trigger anxiety, melancholy, a sense of emptiness. Because the mind, addicted to performance, doesn't know how to deal with free time, doesn't know how to be alone, and deep down fears what it will find when it's no longer running. This fear of not doing isn't natural. It's induced. It's cultural. It's fed by a society that profits from our exhaustion. That turns rest into guilt. That convinces us our value depends on our usefulness. But you are not a machine. You were not made to function all the time. And being alone in silence without tasks should not be a threat. It should be shelter, a space for reconnection, a time for inner listening. Because it is in that stillness that the most neglected parts of you can finally be heard. The tired child, the frustrated adult, the wounded heart, the exhausted body. They all live within you, waiting for the noise to fade so they can speak. When you slow down and allow yourself to simply be, without doing, without performing, you begin to realize that your worth was never in what you produce, but in who you are, and that no matter how much the world tries to deny it, needs no justification. We live intoxicated by stimuli. The phone vibrates, the notification lights up, the feed refreshes, the mind races. There's always something happening, always something to see, respond to, click on. And in the midst of this constant sensory bombardment, we've become unable to endure silence, unable to simply exist without being fed information, images, noise. This addiction to stimulation isn't just a modern exaggeration, it's a symptom of a soul that no longer knows how to be enough on its own. And that's precisely why being alone has become so uncomfortable, because when the external noise ceases, what's left is what we've been avoiding for so long: contact with our own essence, with the inner emptiness, with questions that have no quick answers or like buttons. This addiction has deep roots. It doesn't start with the phone. It starts with the desperate need to feel alive, to feel present, to feel like we belong. And since we learned that those feelings come from the outside, from others' gaze, from interaction, from movement, we've developed emotional dependence on anything that distracts us from the here and now. Social media, series, podcasts, games, work, food, background noise, anything goes as long as it keeps us from diving in, from truly being present in our body, in time, in the moment. Because being present without stimulation requires emotional maturity. It requires the ability to sit with boredom, with anxiety, with restlessness, and no one ever taught us how to do that. On the contrary, we were taught to run whenever silence draws near. The irony is that this flood of stimuli doesn't calm us. It agitates us. Instead of soothing, it overwhelms. And still, we can't stop. Because stopping would mean facing, confronting, and often, the mind believes it won't be able to handle it. But the body gives us signs. Exhaustion appears, insomnia takes hold, the constant feeling of being sped up, even without knowing why. Moments of rest become a source of guilt. And when we're alone, without distractions, the discomfort becomes unbearable. That's when the addiction reveals itself. When we can no longer be with ourselves without needing to numb with something. Silence now feels like an enemy. But in truth, it's an invitation. An invitation to slow down, to listen, to feel. But we're so conditioned to urgency, to novelty, to clicks, that even 5 minutes without stimulation causes us distress. This addiction is shaping how we think, how we relate, how we experience time. We've lost the ability to contemplate, to focus deeply, to enjoy simple pleasures, and most importantly, we've lost touch with ourselves. We keep asking why anxiety has risen so much. The answer may lie right there, in the noise overload, in the terror of emptiness, in the absence of real presence. Relearning how to be in silence is a revolutionary act. It's a practice and a challenge. At first it may feel impossible. The mind will resist, the body will fidget, but little by little something settles. The breath returns to rhythm. The mind finds rest. The inner world begins to expand. And then we discover that there is life in silence, that there is comfort in the pause, that there is self-love in the choice to disconnect in order to reconnect. Stimulation is addictive, but presence heals. And being alone without distractions can stop being torture and become the most powerful form of reunion. There's a kind of loneliness even more cruel than being alone. It's the loneliness that happens in company, the one that appears in the middle of a party, a family gathering, a marriage, a group of friends. You talk, smile, interact, but inside, it feels like no one truly sees you, like you're surrounded by people, but devoid of connection. This is the paradox many people live. They do everything to avoid being alone, constantly seek company, but still feel an unbearable emptiness. That's because physical presence doesn't mean emotional presence. The crowd can act as a disguise, as anesthesia, as a desperate attempt to silence a deeper pain, the pain of never having been truly understood. Society sells the idea that the cure for discomfort is in others. Go out, find someone, fill your time with people. But no one talks about what to do when relationships don't nourish, when conversation is superficial, when affection is conditional, when connection requires a mask. You try, you show up, you participate, but you come home feeling like something is missing. And it's not weakness, it's not exaggerated neediness. It's a clear sign that your body and soul are asking for more than social contact. They're asking for connection, for listening, for honest exchange, for genuine care. Things that can't be found through mere physical presence, but through emotional presence. The problem is, out of fear of being alone, many people settle for emotional crumbs. They stay in connections that offer no support, relationships based on convenience, conversations that always skim the surface. What matters is having someone nearby, even if that presence brings no peace. And gradually this becomes the norm. We forget how to recognize what true connection feels like. We start confusing noise with belonging, but the body knows, it senses, and it protests. Emotional exhaustion, feeling empty even while socializing, the urge to hide after being around people, all of that are symptoms of an unresolved hunger, the hunger for authentic, reciprocal, and deep connection. It's important to say being surrounded by people doesn't protect you from emotional abandonment, because abandonment isn't the absence of a body, it's the absence of care, of attention, of listening, of presence. And when we spend life adapting to fit in, pretending to be okay, trying to please, we end up surrounded by people who love versions of us, but not who we truly are. That realization is painful, but also liberating, because from that point on we can begin to make different choices. We can stop chasing crowds and start building relationships that mean something. Relationships where we can exist without performing, where silence isn't scary, where love isn't conditional on usefulness, and most importantly, we can begin to offer ourselves what we've always expected from others: true presence. From the moment you learn to listen to yourself, to care for yourself, to accompany yourself, the crowd loses its power to distract you from loneliness. You begin to choose your company more carefully. You begin to realize that a few deep connections are worth far more than 100 empty ones. And being alone stops being a threat and becomes a legitimate, honest, necessary choice, because you finally understand that if you're going to feel lonely, it's better to feel it in peace with yourself than suffocated in the middle of a crowd that never really heard you. We live in a culture that idolizes self-sufficiency. From a young age, we hear that relying on others is a sign of weakness, that needing is a flaw, that asking for affection is clinginess, and clinginess, we were taught, is something to eliminate, not embrace. So we learn to hide our emotional needs as if they were defects, to pretend we're fine alone, even when our chest is silently screaming for a hug. to smile with independence when what we truly crave is a gaze that says, "I'm here with you." And so a generation was raised terrified of appearing fragile, of admitting they miss someone, that they long to be missed. And this emotional repression comes with a silent cost, the shame of needing. That shame is so well disguised that it often shows up as pride. I don't need anyone. I can handle it alone. I enjoy my solitude. Phrases that sound like strength, but often hide open wounds. Because the truth is, we are social beings. Our biology is built for connection. We need touch, voice, affection. We need to be seen, held, validated, not as weakness, but as part of what makes us human. The problem is that performance culture taught us that we only deserve love if we don't inconvenience anyone, if we don't ask for too much, if we expect nothing, as if the simple act of needing were a burden, as if having emotional needs made us less worthy. This cruel logic causes many people to live a silent dilemma. They deeply want to ask for presence, but feel ashamed to even think about admitting it. They'd rather isolate than risk appearing needy. And ironically, the more they deny that need, the more it grows inside, the more disconnected they feel, the more they sabotage their relationships. They create distant bonds, avoid opening up, pretend not to care, and in the end, they reaffirm what they feared most, that they're alone. Not because there aren't people around, but because they built walls to appear strong. But there is no intimacy without surrender, no affection without vulnerability, and no healing in solitude born of shame. We need to talk about this. We need to normalize the fact that missing someone is natural, that wanting company is not a weakness, that longing to be cared for, heard, held, is part of what makes us human. There is nothing wrong with recognizing that being alone is not always comfortable. Neediness only becomes a problem when it is denied, repressed, shamed, because then it disguises itself as sabotage, as distance, as wounded pride, when in truth, it just wanted to be seen, just wanted to be treated with kindness, just wanted to be heard without judgment. If you feel ashamed for needing affection, know this: it does not make you less. It connects you to what is most real in you, to your capacity to love, to desire, to build bonds. And more than that, to the courage to show up fully, even in the trembling parts. When you embrace that need with tenderness, it transforms. It stops controlling you from the edges and becomes a sincere compass, a reminder that you deserve real connection. You deserve to be loved, not for hiding what you feel, but for allowing yourself to feel. And maybe, by accepting your own need with gentleness, you'll inspire others to do the same and turn the fear of needing into a bridge for connection. There is a rare and powerful experience that few truly know, the kind of silence that comforts, that moment when you're alone and yet feel whole, complete, not because you don't need anyone, but because you're no longer trying to fill yourself with just any presence. This is what we call emotional solitude, the art of being with yourself without suffering, of being enough without loneliness, of listening to yourself without distress, a state of inner presence that doesn't deny the importance of relationships, but also doesn't turn them into a crutch. Solitude is the balance point between unbearable emptiness and forced isolation. It's when being alone stops being punishment and becomes a refuge. Reaching this state, however, requires deep emotional reconstruction, because most of us grew up believing that silence is a sign of failure, that free time is wasted time, and that being alone means rejection. Unlearning that takes courage. It takes relearning how to inhabit your own body, how to engage with your own mind, how to recognize that your existence doesn't need someone else's gaze to be real. At first, solitude feels like a strange place. Restlessness shows up, guilt knocks. The mind demands, but with time that space begins to expand, it begins to feel fertile, and what was once anguish becomes comfort. What used to be noise turns into contemplation. What once felt empty becomes presence. It's important to understand, solitude is not isolation. Isolation is running from the world out of fear. Solitude is diving into yourself by choice. It's the difference between locking yourself away and welcoming yourself in, between escaping pain and embracing silence. And it's in that space that healing begins. Because when you stop chasing distractions, you begin to realize what you truly need. You start hearing your intuition. You start understanding your limits. You begin to care for yourself with the gentleness you once searched for in others. And ironically, the more you become a presence for yourself, the deeper your external relationships become, because you stop demanding from others what only you can offer: inner shelter. In solitude, time gains a new texture. Mornings feel softer, pauses gain meaning. The little things, the warm coffee, the breeze at the window, reading without rush, become important again, because you're no longer trying to run from the moment. You're inside it, present, whole. And contrary to what many think, this doesn't distance you from others. It brings you closer, because only those who are well with themselves don't turn others into crutches. They don't demand constant presence. They don't treat love as a guarantee for survival. They love freely. They connect truthfully. They choose to be together, not just endure being alone. It's in this place that peace settles in, when your own company is no longer a prison, but a shelter. When you don't need to fill the time because it's already filled with you. When you realize that being alone isn't a sign of abandonment, but a chance for reconnection. And perhaps the greatest freedom anyone can reach isn't living surrounded by people, but being able at the end of the day to sit with yourself and feel at home. In a world that speaks too loudly, listening to yourself has become an act of resistance. Everything pushes us outward. Notifications, demands, noise, comparisons. We are so busy absorbing what comes from the outside that when we are finally alone, silence scares us. But it is precisely in that silence, the one that once felt like a threat, that the deepest healing begins. Inner listening, the kind that doesn't come from books, gurus, or anyone else's advice. It comes from the soul, from the body, from intuition. It's a kind of listening that doesn't judge, doesn't correct, doesn't demand performance. It simply welcomes, and in that welcoming, it transforms. Inner listening is a forgotten muscle. It doesn't impose, it invites. At first, it may feel strange to sit in silence and ask yourself, what am I feeling? The mind tries to answer with logic, with control, with resistance. But little by little, the body begins to speak. The breath reveals tension. The heart whispers longing. The stomach shows anxiety. The fatigue that used to be ignored shows itself in long sighs. Everything that routine hides overflows when the world goes quiet. And the most curious thing is realizing that, even without knowing how, the soul has always known the way, the pain that keeps returning, the desire that was silenced, the answer that was there, just waiting to be heard. But to truly listen, you need presence. You need to stop running, stop trying to fill every second, stop trying to fix everything in a hurry. Inner listening requires time, surrender, respect, because what comes from within doesn't scream, it whispers. And if we're too rushed, too distracted, too wounded, we run over the very thing that could save us. How many times have you ignored a hunch, an intuition, a sensation in your body, and later regretted it? That's not mysticism. It's emotional wisdom. The body speaks before the mind understands. The soul expresses itself before logic can explain. Listening to yourself is about learning to trust that again. It's not about abandoning the world. It's about creating an internal space where the world doesn't drown us. A safe place inside ourselves where the truth can emerge without fear. A silent territory where pain can be named, where joy can be fully felt, where decisions can be made based on integrity, not urgency. When you learn to listen to yourself, you begin to make different choices. You begin to leave places that hurt, to walk away from people who drain you, to say no without guilt. Because you understand that behind every symptom there's a request. Behind every anxiety, there's an unheard need. And maybe that's the true purpose of solitude, to return us to ourselves, to remind us that even when the world is silent, there's a voice within us that never stopped speaking. It was only waiting for you to turn down the volume of all your distractions, so it could finally be heard. And when you begin to listen, day after day with care and patience, you discover something surprising. You're not alone. You never were. Your soul has always been here, steady, present, waiting for you to come back. There is an emotional trap hidden in the way we romanticize self-sufficiency. It tells us that the ideal is to be enough for ourselves, that the truly strong are those who don't need anyone, that the complete human being is the one who finds within themselves everything they need to be happy. But that is a lie, and a cruel one, because it goes against our biology, against the structure of the brain, against the most basic needs of the soul. Human beings are beings of connection. We are born dependent, we survive through the care of others, we develop through exchange, through gaze, through touch, through listening. Needing people is not a flaw, it's a condition. And denying that is cultivating a silent loneliness, disguised as strength. The idea that others are a risk to be avoided didn't come out of nowhere. It's a response to trauma, to rejection, to abandonment. Those who have suffered too much by trusting, by surrendering, by exposing themselves, often build barriers as a form of self-protection. They learn to handle things alone, to expect nothing from anyone, to hide their needs. And over time, they begin to believe that this is maturity, that this is freedom. But deep down, that freedom has a cost. It deprives us of intimacy. It distances us from the possibility of being cared for. It keeps us from accessing the kind of healing that only real connection can offer. Because no matter how independent someone is, there is a place inside each of us that only warms in the presence of another's affection. Accepting this is not a step backward. It's growth. It's recognizing that emotional independence is not the same as isolation. That knowing how to be alone is important, but knowing how to be loved is too. That autonomy doesn't mean rejecting help. It means knowing when to ask for it. That being strong isn't about never needing. It's about recognizing when you do. Society taught us that showing need means being weak, dependent, fragile. But the truest forms of love only bloom where there is vulnerability, only deepen where there is room to be fully seen. And that includes the side of us that misses, that gets hurt, that longs for company, warmth, care. Needing people doesn't make you less. It doesn't weaken you. It doesn't make you inferior. On the contrary, it makes you human. It connects you with what is most real in you. It reminds you that life is made of encounters and that no personal success fills the emptiness left by the absence of affection. You could live in a huge house, travel the world, achieve amazing goals, but if there's no one to share the joy with, everything becomes a colorless backdrop. The presence of another doesn't replace your own. It complements it. It amplifies it. It warms it. Because we are built for touch, for eye contact, for connection, and denying that is to go against the flow of life. So if today you find yourself longing for people, for listening, for comfort, don't feel ashamed. Don't repress it. Honor that feeling. It is legitimate. It is a sign of emotional health, and it might be the starting point for more honest, deeper, more healing relationships. You are not less for needing. You are human, and the human being, contrary to what they say, is not self-sufficient. They are fulfilled in connection. In a culture that idolizes productivity, free time has become uncomfortable, a space that must be immediately occupied, filled, justified, as if the mere act of not doing something rendered the moment invalid. This rush to assign meaning to every second, with tasks, conversations, content, or distractions, reveals a deep discomfort with our own emptiness. We are not used to simply being, to sitting on the porch and looking at the sky, to walking without a destination, to feeling the body, to listening to what the soul whispers when the world goes quiet. And this, which should be a natural part of life, has become rare. Because being present without being productive is now seen as wasteful. But this view is a distortion. Free time doesn't need to be productive to be precious. It doesn't need to yield results to have value. It can simply be lived, breathed, savored. When we stop filling every gap with stimulation, we begin to rediscover the flavor of small things, the smell of coffee, the sound of birds, the feeling of water in the shower, details that the rush of life robs from us. And more than that, we begin to realize that free time is not an empty space. It's a fertile one. It's where creativity blooms, where emotions settle, where the mind finds rest. It's where presence takes root. Rebuilding this relationship with time requires a shift in mindset. We must abandon the logic of time is money and embrace the truth that time is life. It is existence, and there is no full existence where everything is a race. When free time is treated as an enemy, life becomes an endless effort to escape the present, and the present, ignored, responds with symptoms: anxiety, exhaustion, disconnection. How often have you found yourself with a free moment and immediately reached for your phone? How often have you avoided being alone with your thoughts? How often have you treated rest with guilt? This is no accident, it's conditioning. but it can be redefined. One of the most transformative practices is learning to inhabit time with lightness, not as someone fleeing from silence, but as someone who welcomes it. Start small. 1 minute with your eyes closed, a coffee without a screen, a shower without rushing, a Sunday without planning. At first, discomfort may arise, and that's okay. It's a sign that something is being re-educated, that the mind, unaccustomed to the now, is learning to breathe. Over time, the pause stops being a threat. Free time stops feeling empty, and you begin to find joy where there once was unease. Presence is different from occupation. Being present means diving into the moment with awareness, even if nothing important is happening. It means realizing that your existence doesn't need validation through outcomes. That silence is not absence, it's space. That rest is not failure, it's care. When you transform free time into a space for encounter, rather than escape, you rebuild something essential, the capacity to live, not just to produce, but to be fully here. There comes a moment in life when we understand no one can fill the emptiness that is born from disconnection with your own essence. No one, no matter how present, loving, or available, can inhabit the place that only you can occupy within yourself. That realization can hurt at first, because it dismantles the fantasy that healing will come from the outside, from a perfect relationship, an ideal friendship, or a welcoming environment. But it also liberates, because it invites us to take responsibility for our own care. And that's when a silent, deep, and challenging journey begins. Learning how to be with yourself, to be your own comfort, to rebuild, brick by brick, an internal sense of presence that doesn't depend on external presence to exist. Being with yourself doesn't mean isolating from the world or rejecting relationships. It means, above all, learning not to abandon yourself, not treating yourself as the enemy, not repeating within your own mind the same voices that once hurt, criticized, or silenced you. It means beginning to look inward with the same compassion you offer others. To sit with your pain without trying to silence it, to welcome your fear without rushing it away, to listen to your anger without punishing it, to recognize your flaws without humiliating yourself. It's a process of reparenting, becoming for yourself the adult who was missing, the comfort that never came, the gaze that never truly saw. This process, however, is not magical. It comes full of resistance, because self-criticism is an old habit, because we were taught to seek validation outside ourselves, because we've grown used to ignoring our own needs just to fit in. So now, in trying to listen to yourself, it's natural that guilt, shame, and impatience will arise. But it's in those exact moments that internal compassion must step in. When judgment shows up, respond with kindness. When discouragement appears, offer yourself rest. When the emptiness surfaces, breathe with it. Being with yourself means this: not demanding perfection but presence, not demanding strength but tenderness, not pushing forward, but allowing yourself to be. And slowly, something changes. The solitude that once felt unbearable begins to make sense. You start to enjoy your own company, to find peace in silence, to trust your intuition, to acknowledge your limits without punishing yourself for them, to choose your relationships more consciously, to find rest in yourself before rushing outward. You begin to understand that being alone is not a sign of failure, it's an achievement, a space where your soul can breathe, where your body can listen, where your mind can rest. You begin to become a home for yourself, and that changes everything, because once you truly learn to be with yourself, no one can abandon you again, not the world, not others, not even you. The fear of loneliness fades, the urgency to fill voids lessens. The rush to fit in transforms into the peace of belonging to yourself. And in the end, the greatest love you can build is this: the love of never leaving yourself behind again, of not silencing your own pain, of not giving up on being your own refuge. Being with yourself may be the most beautiful way of never feeling alone again. There comes a time when the inner scream fades, not because it was forcefully silenced, nor because it was ignored, but because it was finally heard. Because after so many attempts to run away, after so much noise piled up, after so much loneliness buried beneath performance, you finally sat down with it, face to face, without distractions, without hurry, without fear. And then something shifts. The silence, which once seemed like a monster ready to swallow you whole, reveals itself as a mirror, a space of echo, and also of healing. A territory where everything you once avoided begins to transform into the raw material of reconnection. Silence becomes home, a home where you meet yourself, not to hide but to truly exist. It's in that space of listening that the soul finally rests, because now it no longer needs to scream. It no longer needs to be noticed through pain, anxiety, or urgency. It can simply be, breathe, stay. Silence becomes a form of care, a nourishing pause, solid ground. It doesn't demand, compare, or judge. It simply receives you. And in receiving you, it returns to you the wholeness that the world once fragmented, because it's in silence that you begin to remember who you were before you needed to prove anything, before you needed to be someone, before you got lost in the rush to fit in. Peace doesn't come from the outside. It doesn't settle in just because the world slowed down or because people finally understood you. It arrives when you stop abandoning yourself, when you understand that the most powerful presence you can cultivate is your own, when you realize that you no longer need an audience to validate your existence, that being with yourself is enough. That silence, no matter how terrifying it once was, is now fertile ground, a place of roots, a shelter that doesn't suffocate but sustains. And in that shelter, you begin to bloom. You begin to build a new relationship with your own mind, your own body, your own time. You start choosing connections that nourish rather than distract. You begin to fill your free time with authenticity rather than urgency. You find joy in being alone, not as a rejection of the world, but as a celebration of your own presence. And then, for the first time in a long time, you feel whole, not because nothing hurts anymore, but because now you know you can hold yourself, that you no longer need to flee, that you can stay. Silence is no longer punishment. It is home. It is fertile soil for all that is yet to come. And when life becomes noisy again, as it always does, you'll know where to return, inward, to that safe place where the scream became a whisper, where the pain turned into care, where fear became an embrace, where loneliness became companionship, and where your own presence at last was enough to heal you.